Hello and welcome to Insight Live, the IT Experts Take. I'm Jason Rader, your host for this event, and today we'll be talking about understanding the benefits and challenges of citizen development. We've got some IT experts with me here that are going to lead us through this conversation. First, we have Carm Taglienti, a distinguished engineer with me here at Insight. We have Michael Nardone, Senior Manager in Services, and Jay Broad, Senior Architect. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Great Thank you, Jason.
So, let's start off with, which we always do, what are we talking about here? So who wants to take a stab at what we mean from the perspective of citizen developer? And I think all of us kind of, that makes perfect sense, but to bring everybody up to speed who's joining us, who's not familiar with the concept.
Well, I guess I'll go first. I'll kind of jump in with probably the answer that everybody's been thinking about. We think a lot about shadow IT, right? So I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot of the benefits, which we'll get to, but it serves a very relevant purpose within the organization. It allows business people or even developers to be able to create applications in a much faster way, better aligned to the business process. And so that's how I tend to think about it. But we can also talk about the shadow IT element of it because that's part of the concern. So I'll let my esteemed colleagues talk a little bit about what they think.
Yeah, when I think of citizen development, it's really the democratization of that development function across organizations. So, when we look at your mission critical applications that your, classic software engineers are working on, there's just too big of a backlog for them to work through every item that needs, applications built. And it allows individuals in your organization that are focused on business process within your business units to be able to take on that development function to grab greater efficiency and work productivity into their day-to-day life in your business units.
And that's a really good point, Michael, because it really comes down to, instead of the business people having to explain their business problem to the technical folks, we're sort of taking the technical tools and bringing them to the business people in a manner where they can use them. So it becomes very close to the requirements at that point.
Love it. I think all those combined are perfect. And so just to go a nuance kind of layer deeper than this, is when we say citizen development, do we always believe that that's kind of some instantiated program within an organization, or are we just talking about the fact that there's availability for tools that individuals can use to enhance their working environment?
I guess I'll go first. So I think it's a little bit of both, right? So it really ends up being the availability of the tools, and as sort of, I'll call it with cloud, with automation, with the ability to provide sort of PaaS level services, it becomes much easier for us to imagine that a good idea can turn into an actual implemented solution. And so that's general purpose, even within the organization or outside of it, right? So I can't tell you how many times people, students of mine actually create their own applications by using some of these low no-code solutions and deploy them because they had a great idea. And the same thing would be true within the organization. So we want to make sure that the people that are, innovative or are looking to accomplish a specific objective within the organization, be it workflow or other, in order to make their job more efficient or even to take advantage of an opportunity, they can use these tools to help them to be able to do that. And, we'll get into what those tools really mean, but in general, that's really, I think, the big impact of all of this.
Yeah, and I would certainly say it starts with the availability of these tools, right? I mean, these things are readily available for users within lines of business outside of that classic software development function. With the availability of the tool, though, where we see organizations that are thriving, they actually are putting scaffolding and programs around being a citizen developer. So where it starts very organically, serving the needs of my business, being able to increase efficiency, productivity, again, what we see organizations doing this very well are the ones that understand the effectiveness that can drive, and then putting the scaffolding and programs around that.
And I think where you start to see the difference between what was traditionally called shadow IT, which has a little bit of some nefarious baggage with it, versus citizen development, is when the company starts to put some guardrails up, so it sort of empowers the users, versus this going on completely outside the purview of IT. There's some back and forth there where it's building on a foundation that's supported by IT, but it's not necessarily things that IT needs to build.
And I really loved what you just said, Jay, because you said we put up guardrails to empower people, because a lot of people think guardrails are confine you to a certain place. But I do agree, once you kind of establish and define something, it gives people to know where the boundaries are, and that is liberating, I think, to a lot of folks. And so we were joking earlier about how loud my keyboard was because I'm old. But I think of the old days, and so I'm going way back, probably too rudiment for this conversation, but you'll get my point in a second. But like in the old days, we used to, pride ourselves on the batch files that we made to get things done. That's kind of the early stages of my experience with automation and things like that, where we used to have to set up tons and tons of computers to push them out and things along those lines, and then ghosting and blah, blah, blah. And then would create all of these chains of events that would happen. But none of that was ever really sanctioned by the organization. It was us. I think lazy is the perfect thing to be if you want to automate in advance, because we were trying to make it easy for us to do this job. And we would employ tons of tools that some were provided, some were free, and all of that. So I think, as we get into that shadow IT conversation, the similarities between that and that, let's talk about, the challenges of there not being guardrails up with something like that, because I just talked about something that I thought was endearing and helped us get a lot done. What are some of the challenges to something like this?
Well, I guess we'll keep going in order. So I'll go first. This isn't intentional, by the way, right? But in general, I think that the challenges really become one of maybe not knowing what you don't know to some extent. And I don't want to call it ignorance necessarily, but if there are concerns around things like securitization of data or access, or potentially even being able to create workflows that might be contrary to corporate policy, there's nobody really checking for it. So those are the kinds of things that we really need to either raise awareness or somehow come up with guardrails that are easier to work within for the producers of these kinds of things. So like you were saying before, I remember batch code too, by the way, but back in the day. But I mean, we were sort of limited in terms of what we could do. Like, we couldn't really create an application necessarily, but now you can actually go so much further, especially with no-code solutions. And if you do go that far, then the implications become wider ranging. So I think that's some of the things that we need to think about as we sort of move into that realm. But I think, and we'll hopefully get to this, where we talk about like, how do you combat that? So if there is sort of this sort of, I'll call it a, CI/CD pipeline model, where we actually start to move applications that are created through a bit of a process where we can at least check for what are the things that are most important to us from a guardrail perspective, then we can at least be aware of what's happening, as opposed to just saying, hey, let people release stuff into production, so to speak. But by the same token, we talked about this as well, sort of the determinant or the one thing that we want to make sure that we don't do is stifle innovation. So you want people to create those cool, innovative kinds of ideas for efficiency's sake, without necessarily constraining their ability to do so. So it's a tough dilemma.
Yeah, I think it's so important when we talk guardrails, we talk governance and policy. We want IT to have visibility and control, but we want to encourage and empower the citizen developer, right? And so as we look across these modern no-code, low-code platforms, right, we look at really the changes that we've seen and the trends across cloud computing. It's how can we deliver policy, manage risk for the organization, but equip our workforce, right? As we see more and more of the new workforce are digital natives, we want to be able to empower them to be a citizen developer. They're a constituent of our organizations, and we want to ensure that they can be productive for a business unit while we get the classic protections that IT would have in the organization. So when we see citizen development done right and programs done right, we have all those protections in place, but yet we're equipping and empowering without stifling innovation and creativity.
And, we've been talking a lot about sort of the guardrails from the IT perspective. But there's a level of discipline that you can try to instill in your citizen developers that has them sort of put up their own guardrails. And that's when you start talking about things like backups, source control, access control as far as sharing the things that you're building. Even something as simple as naming conventions, so someone else can come in and sort of understand what you're doing. These tools have really come a long way from the days of Excel macros, where there was sort of one person that had the macro and it was on their machine. And if you passed it around and somebody else made a change, now you have 2 or 3 or 5 or 100 different versions of it. And mostly, Excel, it has a very powerful programming languages behind it, but it can become very unintelligible very easily. So that level of discipline of trying to make it so that it's shareable and so that it doesn't just become knowledge that's in one person's head is also another way to look at these guardrails.
Love it.
And let me just add, I'll just add quickly to that to break up the cycle here, is we've, when you think about that as well, it's like, in some ways, we want to make sure that we have put things in place, called the guardrails, where we can control the environment. But we also want to make it, as I said before, as simple to use as possible. So how do we embed that then into the process? So if using the no-code solution, which we see a lot of, has the built-in backups, for example, has the security mechanisms placed, ties to our Active Directory, so that it becomes simpler to enforce the corporate policies without necessarily having to understand or implement them on your own. And so I think there's really a nice middle ground there, where we can say, if we use certain kinds of no-code, low-code techniques, then we have the ability to actually take advantage of the infrastructure that we already have in place, or what some of those conditions or best practices might be in the grand scheme of things. So I think it's really a nice way to collaborate across the board. And the final point I'll make is that we all know that there's a shortage of developers. And so it's really difficult for us to think that, we want to prevent this kind of thing from happening. We want to encourage it, but also make sure that we can sort of fit within the realm of, I'll call it, corporate policies in terms of implementation of code, et cetera. So.
And I would say, in the context of citizen developers, we call that the app gap, right? Your enterprise software development, right? There's a finite amount of resources, finite amount of software engineers, and there's always going to be a gap between what your business needs and then what's in the backlog. And so by doing low-code, no-code platforms correctly to empower a citizen developer, that's where we can really see connectors and components there, right? Those high-level functions of authenticating applications, right? Protecting data from data exfil, those pieces, right? When you do those platforms, right, you're building in those reusable components, so your citizen developers can be very focused on the business process without having to understand all those components and what you would look as classical functions for IT behind the scenes.
And that sort of brings us to the concept of blended teams a little bit, because when you think about using these tools for doing some of this citizen development, you're thinking of it almost the same way you think about automation. Automation is not necessarily about replacing humans with robots. It's taking some of the more mundane or reproducible aspects of a job and automating it so that the humans can focus on the more important things. So when you build automation, there's always touch points where the humans need to probably get involved, but they're very focused on those higher level tasks. And the same thing happens here, where many of these citizen developers can go quite far with their applications, but then maybe they need to get to a data source that's a legacy data source, or something that's not easy to connect to, or has some kind of funky authentication, or whatever it might be. And that's when you would bring in, say, a pro developer to build a custom connector, or some other place that sort of serves it up and gives them a safe way to access those things. And it becomes both of those different aspects of your development organization working together.
Yeah, I would even go so far as to say, and this is the experience I've had going, through a couple decades in the industry. It's been design techniques. So we used to call these proof of concepts or prototyping tools, but now they've become actual, products in and of themselves. But there's nothing better than to basically say, look, if you wanted to create a solution that is viable and you can experience the outcome, and the people that are creating it are the ones that have the idea, or at least understand what the outcome needs to be, then it becomes much easier for you. So as opposed to, say, requisitioning a team and getting everybody collected together and collecting requirements, and then trying to figure out what you're going to build, and then going back and doing the whole, sort of standard process, independent of agile, but it still allows us to be able to say, hey, we can quickly fail fast. We can say, is this viable or not? Does this work or not? Does it allow us to be able to continue forward? And, if it is the case where it's like, yeah, we do need to build, maybe faster, better environments, we can do that. At least we have high confidence that that investment is worthwhile for us across the board. So I think there's kind of a hidden advantage there as well. So it allows us to be able to take good principled design approaches and allow them to be manifest within the organization for competitive advantage.
Yeah, I would add to that, not all use cases are suitable for citizen development, right? So you look at business critical, your mission critical applications, right? Those are likely not going to be assigned to citizen developer, right? We're really talking about, I think, pushing down and when you get it, I think the right use cases aligned to citizen development, right? So you have to know really what are really your blue chips, what is key and critical to you as a business that should go through your classic software engineering and development versus how can I empower my organization but manage the risk while doing so.
You bring up an interesting point, because when I think of citizen developer, I typically think of organic things that are driven from the user base up. But are there organizations that actually have a citizen development program in place that actually push down to those guys to contribute? I mean, obviously there is, but I mean, I don't think about it typically that way.
Yeah, absolutely. We see very much a high level of this is citizen development program. We want to empower our business to take advantage of these low code, no code type platforms. And what's interesting is there will be a gap that you see bridged between your classic software engineering with your business users. And so you're looking at them as putting in those reusable components and connectors and driven from, again, that top down. And that a lot of that is just the fact that as our workforce has become, again, more digital native, that is becoming both our users' expectations and our teammate expectations. Those tools are available to them and they're able to empower and do their jobs more effective. So disciplined approach with a program, again, satisfies the needs across stakeholders, across IT, teammates, and clients to make a pretty powerful program from the top down.
And I don't want to, I mean, I think what you're describing also is maybe a cultural phenomenon, not so much necessarily, millennial in nature, but I think it's just the phenomenon where everyone has a voice, everyone can contribute good ideas. You don't have to have a degree in software engineering to be able to have a good idea to create a program. So we're basically lowering the barrier to entry that allows others to participate, because I think that's also a pretty big benefit to the organization if you look at it culturally, where you're saying, hey, everybody's contributing because you might have exposure to the business more than the technology people do, and then maybe even working more collaboratively allows us to then create sort of the best projects, programs that will allow us to be able to be successful.
And that brings up the point of sometimes using these low no code tools as a communication mechanism between the business users and the technical users, because that's the classic software engineering problem, is trying to get that information back and forth across that divide, which is sometimes wider and sometimes narrower, and to be able to put something up and say, we want it to do this, and maybe you've taken it as far as you can take it, and now someone else needs to broaden it or bring it up to a level where it can be production. Having something that you can see and touch and run and test can make a huge difference in those conversations.
So I think where we've arrived, so we start out kind of what are the challenges of this? I think we quickly went into the challenges are going to exist with any program that is instantiated or not, a program that's not instantiated at an organization. If we don't kind of define things, they can go off the rails from a continuity perspective. They can go off the rails from mishandling data or other types, or just non-documentation or segmentation, containerization, those different types of things that cause problems in just about any project. And I also think we've kind of arrived at the fact that this, from a cultural perspective, from a capability perspective, and an enablement perspective, there's goodness associated with this. So, but to Michael's point, this isn't how you're replacing your professional development team. This is basically another level of innovation and capability within your organization, if done correctly. Fair to say?
Right.
And I think we've said tools. So before I finish, we said tools a bunch and we haven't mentioned any. So I think we at least got to give the folks out there that are waiting to hear what we're talking about when we say these tools. We should probably hit that.
Well, depending on the cloud that you're talking about, I mean, you can talk about the Power Platform, or there's tools like Zapier that sort of jump from cloud to cloud. There's things like AppSheet in the Google Cloud, and Amazon. It seems like every year or so they come up with some new paradigm, sometimes by acquisition or sometimes because something that was homegrown, like Honeycode or something like that. So depending on the platform or where you sort of lean from a cloud perspective, may sort of dictate the tools that you have available to you or the tools that you're interested in.
That's fair.
And I would even go so far as to even, so I spend a lot of time in the data science world. So, I mean, even things like Jupyter notebooks, the runtime engines with Python or with R allows us to be able to create applications relatively simply, whether in the cloud or, run in our own kernel locally. But those are, in my mind, those are also sort of low code, no code solutions. Maybe not no code as much as low code. But I think in addition to mentioning tools, I think it's important for us to also realize that it's like somebody within the organization, and it probably, again, needs to be some kind of governance model that you put in place. And we've done this before. Like, for example, I had a customer that was using AppSheets. They built so many extensions to that it almost became impossible for us to reverse engineer what they were doing. Because I think you can go too far as well. So it's a cultural aspect of what is the real purpose for using low code, no code solutions? What are the objectives? And then know when to move into, maybe we do need to create maybe a more disciplined approach to how we're going to implement this particular project by using sort of standard tools, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, you can go too far one way or the other, right? And we all know it's really difficult to use like a formalized software engineering environment to be able to create prototypes, because you're not going to get them in a week. So, both sides of the spectrum exist, but I think for companies that are successful with this, they really do understand, what's the purpose? Well, how do we integrate the two of them together? How do we leverage the assets from one in the other? And they can really make it successful.
So as I'm thinking about this, and and I'm trying to formulate my question appropriately. I think of organizations that, it's always, as folks who do what we do, we typically love to think of the program starting out well-defined, and with a governance model in place and assigned people in charge of different aspects of it, and then resources associated with those. So I think there's probably two elements. There's the organizations that are thinking, hey, this is a good thing to take us to the next level. And then there's we got to clean up a lot of, is there more of a cleanup issue in most organizations, or do you think most organizations just haven't harnessed this? Because I kind of feel like it's almost always, there's got to be some amount of cleanup that's got to go on. Mm-hmm. Is that fair?
I would say this almost always starts as a groundswell motion, right? It almost always starts from bottom up. So when it comes for that program and governance, right, you're already dealing with a pretty large set of citizen developed acts. In fact, I would go so far as say, as most organizations that I talk with on a day-to-day basis, they don't realize how much citizen development may or may not be going on already. So you always see that being added on after the fact. We'd love to say we started up front and embraced it, but the reality is it's taking place today, it's effective today, and you need to embrace and get your arms around it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we would love to think about, like, we've been talking very positively about the impact on the organization and all the wonderful things that can happen, but most of my experiences, and especially when I was in a consulting role, we would actually be creating those projects, low code, no code projects, because they were effectively flying under the radar of the IT organization. So we would be hired by, the
darn consultants.
Right, the business teams, and we're like, oh, we want to do X, Y, and then well, we can't because IT is preventing us from doing this, and we need it in the next month. So that is a very real phenomenon. I think we can understand and appreciate the benefit, but it's hard to culturally transform the organization to really take advantage of what we've been talking about.
And I think it is the responsibility of organizations like ours who go in to do that, to raise that to a level. We can't just, hey, we're solving your problem that you asked us to, and we're blind to anything else that's going on in your organization. I think we understand the implications of this, and that doesn't mean we're always going to be successful, including other parts of the organization or that, but it does mean that we've got to pay attention to that, because the impact could be great. Even though you have got a satisfied client at a certain place in an organization, we're out for this overall solution ultimately to help the organizations get better.
Yep.
Yeah, sometimes instead of cleanup, there's a matter of just coming clean and making sure that IT is in the loop.
Yeah, agreed. And I think, we always talk about some of these solutions kind of take IT out of the mix or intentionally try to do that. I really think including IT is in everybody's best. It works out better for everybody, because I think a lot of times people think about the acquisition of a capability and not the overall maintenance, operationalizing it and have the continuity associated, resiliency associated with it needs. And that's what IT does automatically. So I think a lot of people forget about the back end, the middle and the back end of a lot of things that they're doing, and are only thinking about the front end and how easy it is to do it this way. Meanwhile, there's some rigors associated with how you manage this in a long term in a large enterprise organization.
Yeah, once you go from automating something locally, or maybe it's just for you, and then it starts to expand out to your teammates and then maybe your larger organization, once it becomes production or critical in some way to the way that you run your business, you're in over your head. And at that point, you need to start looking at, how do we support this? How do we replicate it? How do we spread this knowledge out? How do we gate what features are coming next? How do we move this forward? I mean, all the classic software engineering project type problems rear their head once you reach sort of critical mass.
So that's a great question. Groundswell, you've got stuff going on, you've got your professional development side. Who owns this? Like who initiates this? And I'm sure it can come from multiple directions, but is this something that, because it seems like it's in everyone's best interest, who would we classically identify as the kind of the owner of this?
I think that's a really good question. I think in the grand scheme of things, it's probably, I think it's split across multiple organizations. So I think IT has their interest and their understanding. I think the business does as well, in terms of how do they, what benefit are they getting from it? And then how can they actually collaborate with IT in order to be able to adhere to the best practices policies that are required. So I think it goes across the board, which I know is not a great answer, right? Because then you're like, oh, great, now we've got split responsibilities. What are we going to do about that? But I think it does. It's a good reflection, I think, on sort of the inclusive culture model, where you're basically saying, look, we're doing this for the best interest of the organization. It's not a bad thing. It's not a panacea either. So how do we work within the context of what we're trying to achieve? And it's, the problem of the groundswell, I think, is it's a good one, but it's also one of those things where it's like, if you're, whatever, trying to redesign your house, you do a room at a time, and finally you say, the foundation can't support it, I have to actually tear it all down. You have to be very open to that. So you have to basically look at it and say, okay, well, let's do what's right for the business, and let's agree to how this works. It's not just a matter of I shoved it over to IT and said, okay, you guys manage it now, because there's a whole bunch of stuff going on there. So I think it's really that transparency and cultural aspect of like the shared responsibility model. That's a big part of it. But it's again, tough to do. But as we were saying, raising awareness, I think, is a good way to start, just so that you understand what the problem is before you necessarily have to solve it.
Yeah, and I would certainly agree on the shared responsibility model. If you ask me, pin down a single role where you've seen it be successful, would be from like a chief digital transformation officer.
Just gonna say transformation or chief digital officers, or even CIOs that are, working across. I think CISOs, in my role as well. I think it's something that, as we're driving a business continuity aspect within our organization right now, this is coming up more than I thought it would, because there's a lot of that in a very, very large organization like ours. We've got a lot of these things that I'm kind of concerned about. Business is running great, but how do we keep it running if we don't manage all of these aspects of it?
It cuts right to what is the relationship between your IT organization and your business organization? Is it a adversarial relationship? Does IT see their role as empowering the business? Does the business see IT as an obstacle to them getting their work done? And, just like anything that you do with automating anything, if the existing manual process is broken and you automate it, you just now have an automated broken process. So you have to sort out those sort of relationship issues up front so you can approach this and collaborate to have that joint responsibility.
Michael, I terribly cut you off. I'm sorry. Please continue with your Chief Transformation Digital Officer comment.
Oh, no, I think it was spot on. I think the really important thing to point out is when we look at a citizen developer as we define it, having knowledge of the business process is significantly more impactful than actually knowing how to code, right? But we also know there are a lot of great best practices across software engineering, version control, source control, being able to deploy and release. And so when we incubate without being unhitched from IT, right? We know our business process really well. We know our day to day, but some of those finer points we don't realize or understand. So that automation is great. Now I've shared it with my teams. Now suddenly I have to version that, package it. Can I control it? Which release are you on, right? And so those are best practices for a reason. So again, that's why that chief digital officer really bridging the gap between what are our business processes and what are those classic, what I would call best practices around software development, IT risk management, et cetera. That's why we see them so impactful in that role.
So typically, I feel like this could go 3 hours. We joked about that earlier, but because we're already hitting our typical mark of stopping, and I'm not about to cut it off immediately. But I do want to kind of at least lean towards wrapping this up from a, where does an organization start? And maybe you guys can talk about who's engaging you from our client base or those types of things, because I think it's the folks that are thinking enough about it to engage are the folks that are probably the catalyst for the change within the organization. And we'll just let everybody kind of do that, and that'll kind of be how we kind of work ourselves out of this. We'll do it in the normal fashion, Carm.
Okay, very good. I was going to say, here I go again. No, I'm just kidding. So my experience has been sort of as I was describing earlier. It's like normally we will talk to the business teams. We'll talk to the business teams are the ones that want to create capability, and to the earlier point about the fact that it can't either deliver fast enough or they just don't want to be able to support this. So you end up with that organizational issue, I think, and that starts. But raising awareness is usually a good thing too. So one thing that we really try to do is to raise that level of awareness, make sure that we understand how this should work within the organization, not just be like, oh, cool, we can make some money on this and let's just deliver a solution. But I also think that as we think about like how do you make it right within the organization, I think that really needs to come from the top down. The recognition, as we were talking about, whether it's transformation officer or digital officer, has to set the stage for this is going to happen. We are going to develop low or no code solutions. We're going to empower the business, and not to reuse the term citizen, but it's a first-class citizen, right? So these are basically things that will happen, things that you have to embrace, things that you have to account for, so that it's not a Groundswell. It's like all of a sudden I've got whatever, an ant problem in my house and I never thought about it. It's like, well, you probably should have thought about it if you live in the middle of the woods. So it's like in today's day and age, this is a thing. We have to recognize it and we have to be able to account for it. So it shouldn't be a surprise. And I think attacking it from that perspective is a good top-down approach. And then the bottom up, as you were saying earlier, Jason, when we get in there and talk to customers, we want to raise that awareness. Let us talk with IT with you. Let us help you to understand how this can integrate into your culture, which may not be the original intent, but it's our obligation to be able to help customers be more successful.
Yeah, and in building off that, Carm, continually engaged by business units saying, we need data visualization. We need to empower these certain workflows. We'd love to automate this, right, for efficiency or time savings. And it's really becoming table stakes for the modern workforce, right? People want to be empowered to be able to do their jobs and do it more effectively. And we as within our organizations and as leaders, we want to equip and empower our people. And so when we see business units approaching, right, it's oftentimes building out those components, right? But what we can do is be a liaison to IT, to software development. And oftentimes, we see I say their heart's in the right place. They want to do the right thing, but it's been so hard to get on IT's backlog. Hey, we need these features to empower our business here, but we've got a huge backlog of mission critical and components here, and we need help getting on that backlog. In fact, we needed a partner who can help us kind of speak the language between how we talk about how we grow our business and be that liaison with IT.
And I think what both Carm and Michael have been saying is it again addresses that relationship between the business and IT. And it starts in the business. and then it probably falls to us or maybe some neutral third party to bring those sides together. It's almost like when smartphones first started appearing in the corporate world. It started on the consumer side. It started with people wanting to use them for work and pushing and pushing and pushing, and IT pushing back saying, we don't know how to manage these and we don't know what our data is going to look like on these devices. And then eventually there was a meeting of the minds where it started in a very restrictive fashion and then started to blossom once there was an understanding on both sides as to, well, you'll be able to do this, but we're not comfortable with you doing that. And this is how we're going to manage it. And these are the requirements for us letting you use these devices. And I think this is a very similar track here, which is there are all these tools that are out there. People are going to want to use them. People are going to start to use them. And then eventually we're going to have to come to some sort of an understanding as to, you know, these are the rules of the road as to how we're going to make this work.
Love it. So I think to kind of sum this up, I mean, I think what I think is interesting about, you know, we're the IT experts take, which is what we're talking about here, IT expert from a perspective. But I always think it's funny how almost all of these solutions that we're talking about involve the business to a very, very large degree. I mean, being an IT expert is really being a business expert as well these days. And, you know, to leverage this, it's got to be run like a program. We could pretty much insert that with just about anything that we're talking about. It's a program. It's got to align with the business. It can't be compartmentalized. All of those things are what it's going to take to make this successful. But I think probably more so than just about any business problem that we've talked about, this could really impact from a cultural perspective, from a technology perspective, from an innovation and automation and all of those things that the business really wants and drives, and shareholders and boards and all those people. This is one of those things I think is, you know, once we get it, got to have executive support, got to have the lines of business on board. We got to have IT on board. Once those things all align, the effort is worthy of that. It could be just almost a miraculous change within an organization. And so, I mean, I love to talk about things that are, I think we can solve hard problems all day long, but this isn't just solving a problem. It's enabling, you know, an organization. And so it was a cool conversation, guys. Obviously I'm passionate about it, and you are too. Thank you for your comments. You guys rock. And we'll probably have to do this again without question, but appreciate all of your support and all of you folks out there. Thanks for joining us. We really love doing this. And if you guys have any comments, feel free to throw them in. And if you have any suggestions for what you'd like to continue this vein of conversation on, please send those as well. If you'd like to know more about what we do at Insight, please visit us at solutions.insight.com. Thanks for joining. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.